Recently, I have been doing a bunch of research for an upcoming essay, and while I haven't started the essay yet, I've become so interested in the topic to the point where I found myself pacing back and forth for like 2 hours yesterday, because I couldn't stop thinking about it and asking myself questions. The autism worms have latched onto this topic like my life depends on it, and I decided to make it everyone else's problem by yapping their ears off about it. In the past, I've discussed dark and taboo subjects in the media and how it can be done correctly, and I've asked you for your opinions on the matter. I like that we can bounce ideas back and forth and discover new ways to create. That's what I want to do today, only this time it's not about games or movies. Today, I want to discuss the picture book, how picture books portray dark subject matter, and ask, is it appropriate for younger audiences? To start off, what is the picture book? A children's book's target audience is specifically young children, obviously, whereas the picture book can be for any age. There are many picture books that both children as young as 3 can engage in, while their parents can also engage and enjoy the book, only for different reasons. According to Children's Picture Books, The Art of Visual Storytelling 2nd edition by Martin Salisbury and Morag Stiles, pictorial storytelling can be traced as far back as the earliest paintings on cave walls, and that the oldest surviving illustrated book is said to be an Egyptian papyrus roll from around 1980 BC. As time has gone on, the picture book has developed throughout the world, and it's believed that the picture book is currently in, or is soon to be, in its golden age. 21st century picture books are evolving to become more author-driven and increasingly diverse in terms of age, gender, and themes. A growing number of author-illustrators are pushing the boundaries and expanding limits of the genre. In chapter 5 of the same book, Salisbury writes, the picture book as a medium of communication for all ages is an increasingly evident and welcome phenomenon. Early European children's stories, including many fairy tales, were often savage and dark in their cautionary nature. He goes on to say, although domestic violence, dying, sex and relationships, sadness and war have all been explored in the pages of picture books, some feel that childhood has become more and more sentimentalized in popular mainstream visual and verbal literature. So that is what I'd like to explore today, giving examples of books that I personally have favored in my research, and sharing some of the opinions I've been given on the matter. As always, if you have differing opinions or different ideas, comment them and we can have a little chat about it. I've mentioned how dark themes in picture books are quite commonplace in European countries, but I haven't yet talked about the UK or the US. America is quite strict about this subject, and by proxy, so is Britain. Not because the topics are considered too dark or too taboo, but because we sell our books in the States and we would like to continue to do so. That being said, in recent years, British authors and illustrators have been releasing more hard-hitting pieces, and they've been big sellers, so I think it's safe to say that Britain is loosening the reins a little bit. Because of this, I took careful consideration when choosing who I talk to about this topic. I asked my general audiences on my social medias, but I specifically chose people who have different walks of life, mainly people who probably haven't done research into this. I've asked Americans, one who is in my age range and the other who is 2 decades my senior. I've asked British friends.
It's like having a job working 24/7 for 2 days on the trot.
I've asked people who have real life experiences with these dark subjects, such as mental health, grief, and abuse. I've asked my mother, whose children are both adults now. I've asked my brother, who just a few months ago had his first child. I even got the opinion of my sister-in-law, who is Bulgarian. I felt it important to ask people from different lives, from different times, and from different places, to get a better understanding of the overall consensus. I asked my questions in a way that got the other person thinking, and from what I found, interestingly enough, is that they changed their opinions as we went on, as I added context and asked further questions, and gave them examples. Totally did that on purpose. I definitely didn't just ask the first question in a very vague way on accident because I'm illiterate and bad at asking questions. First I asked, what do you think about illustrated books that cover dark subject matter such as violence, sex, mental health, etc.? I also clarified that the subject of these books tend to go over the children's head as the illustrations aren't literal, but symbolic, and that the chances of children picking up on these themes are quite slim, unless of course they have experienced it themselves. I asked, do you think these books can be helpful to all ages? And do you think that there's a certain way that it should be done? Most people responded similarly, saying that some subjects should absolutely be kept out of a child's reach, such as sex, but topics like death could be done as long as it's done in a light or sensitive manner. My brother, for example, said, "I think even before becoming a dad, I would disagree with book illustrations containing certain dark subjects like sex, drug abuse, alcohol. Some stuff like death and mental health, which I'd link towards more emotions, can be okay as long as it's used lightly. They can be useful in teaching children from 1 up to 6, I believe, on the different types of emotions, love, grief, sadness, happiness, anger, etc. But more importantly, on how to cope with them and manage their emotions effectively. At this age range, their brains are like sponges and it will absorb everything. And you have to be careful because if they take in too much, they won't know what to do with it. Books and illustrations are perfect items for children because they're colourful, interactive. They'll contain their favourite subjects, animals, dinosaurs, etc. So it really sucks them in. Therefore, I do think it's important that they try and make them as friendly as possible, but at the same time, don't cram so much in to the point that it blows the child's brain to pieces. As the famous saying goes, slow and steady wins the race, and I think this is perfect for a child's development. If a child has experienced some sort of trauma, I don't think it would be wise to put that experience into a book for them to read over again. They need to heal from the experience. It would be better, in my opinion, to talk about the emotions that they feel and give them books on these emotions, so that they can break them down and deal with them effectively. He brings up a few interesting points that others also touched on. For example, the fact that some subjects are okay and perhaps beneficial, but others aren't. Another comment I got was, "I think that children's media can cover a lot of dark topics. It all depends on how you do it. Knowing about death and knowing about violence is imperative. There's a big difference between depicting violence and gore porn, or violence porn." 2 of the people I asked said outright that they personally believe that children shouldn't be exposed to this stuff, both bringing up another one of my brother's points, being that it can be triggering for these children if they themselves have had these experiences. And since children aren't emotionally developed yet, they'll have a hard time dealing with the information they've been given. One person said, "If the child has gone through the experience depicted in the book, there's still a chance that they won't understand the book, so it wouldn't be helpful to them. And if they do understand it, perhaps it could help them process what they've been through, but there's no guarantee since they're so young." I was honestly quite surprised with the amount of agreement within the answers I received. Mainly because, again, I specifically chose these people from all walks of life, who I know have had different experiences. So to hear everyone have similar, if not exact same viewpoints was really interesting to me. I was introduced to this subject in uni during a lecture, where we analysed the pictures as we went along. So I already had insight on the types of books being referenced. I didn't give these guys that prior insight. I put everyone on the spot and had them think about it with very limited information. So now it was time to give examples and ask further questions. I used the same books as examples for each person, the first being The Duck, Death and the Tulip. This is a book about death, in case that wasn't obvious from the title. The story starts off with Duck, as she's standing alone with an uncomfortable feeling that she's being watched. She turns to find Death, a cozy dressed, kind-looking skeleton, holding a tulip. She asks him why he's been following her, and he introduces himself. To Duck's horror, she believes he is there to take her away, but Death explains that he's always been there, just in case something happens, and reassures her that he's not the one that makes it happen. Rather, that is life's job. Death and Duck become unlikely friends, going to the pond and climbing trees together. During this time, Duck realizes her own mortality, and worries about what will be left behind, or where she'll go when she dies. But again, Death reassures her that she will not mourn all that she has left behind. Winter grows near, and Duck feels it's cold for the first time. She lay down to rest beside Death, who's keeping her warm. When Death wakes up, he finds that she's cold and still, and no longer breathing. Death picks her up, takes her to the great river, lays the tulip on her chest, and gently nudges her on her way. He finds himself feeling moved by the passing of Duck, but remarks, "That's just life." Personally, I love this book so much, but I wanted to see what others had to say. I sent the pages to my brother first, asking him to have a look through and tell me what he thinks. He said, "It's actually quite sad. I've seen a couple of pictures and videos about death being an entity and travelling alongside an animal. Then you see the animal peacefully go. It's quite nice." I asked him if he thinks it's a good book to read to a child, perhaps after they've experienced the death of a loved one for the first time, and are struggling to process it. He said, "Yeah, I'd say so. It might help them come to terms with the reality of it." I then explained the story to one of my friends, and this is what she had to say. "This book absolutely works for kids. It's especially endearing and I think could be very relieving for children who lose their pets." My mother's reaction might just be the funniest out of the lot of them. I allowed her to read the book herself, and her reaction was, "That's it? She just dies anyway? What the fuck?" Later we talked about the possibility of this book being a comfort for children, experiencing grief for the first time since it's portrayed in a neutral, soft manner. She agreed that this book could potentially be a good read for audiences, including children, dealing with grief, especially after having a chance to really think about it. Next, we discussed a book called Cinnamon. Cinnamon, translated to Angry Man, is a book written by Grodal and illustrated by her husband, Svien Nyas. I probably said that wrong, I am so sorry. The Norwegian couple were approached by a family counsellor who wanted a book about domestic violence to use as a conversation piece within his practice. Due to the dark topic, the book wasn't a hit seller, but it did in fact become a conversation piece, with an animated short film being released based off of it. The story starts with the mother and child as we see the mother preparing for her husband's arrival. All of this is from the child's perspective. The boy realizes his father is home, and he asks himself, is Daddy quiet? Is Daddy happy? Is Daddy calm? In the background, we see objects hanging on the edges of tables and counters, such as a hammer and a ceramic plate. This is enough to show that there is tension in the house. The mother is depicted as very light and delicate, whereas the father is large and boxy. The smile on his face is a juxtaposition of his red knuckles. As the father's fuse grows shorter, he grows larger, with his veins becoming more prominent and his colour growing warmer in contrast to the off-white background. Soon he's towering over his wife and child. The aim of this book is to showcase the seriousness of a child living in a violent environment, placing a significant amount of emphasis on the vulnerability of a child living in an adult reality. The overall message in this story is that for any child in the little boy's position, you are not alone, and this is not your fault. Interestingly, when speaking to one of my volunteers, I call them volunteers, but let's be real, they had no choice, he brought up the topic of where and when these books should be read by children. Before discussing Cinnamon, he said, "I don't believe these books should be on school library shelves. I think there is a place in this world for them, perhaps with a counsellor or some other professional." I find this interesting since, as I said, the book was requested by a family counsellor who believed this book could be helpful, not only for children, but for men and women as well. As we've discussed, two of the main concerns have been that this could trigger a child dealing with a violent home life, or on the other hand, it could completely go over their head. In that case, this book could potentially be more of a fascination for those of us who enjoy dark media, such as psychological horror, rather than a source of comfort for a struggling child. I once again asked my brother and he said this: "That actually sounds alright. I can see how an adult would interpret it. For a child, it would likely go over their head. I was chatting with my wife, and she believes I'm overthinking it. When she was a child, she had the original story of The Little Mermaid, where she dies or turns into foam. She said the concept just went over her head as a child, but now she understands the idea. She believes that as long as it has age-appropriate illustrations, it will be fine, just not too graphic." Here is when I got to hear my sister-in-law's opinion, who, if you remember, is Bulgarian. What she says is quite interesting to me, since she's not focusing on the actual subject matter itself, but rather the illustrations and what they depict. As I've said, very few illustrations in these books are literal, unless they're not disturbing, in which case they don't need to be hidden under symbolism. One of my other buddies had this to say: "It's good to have clear instructions on how to get help in a situation like that, and to know that the way you're being treated is not okay. The way the mother and father are depicted is good, one clearly has less control than the other. This book is very good at telling the story while not needing to show you all the gory, unpleasant details. You see just enough in the illustrations alone. And, like I said before, sometimes what's left unseen is most effective." And as one of my totally not against their will volunteers quoted earlier, they believe that violence is imperative, meaning that children are likely to witness it at an early age, whether it be on TV or in the school playground, and thus they should understand what it is. The final book I wanted to talk about is Michael Rosen's Sad Book. Written by Michael Rosen and illustrated by Quentin Blake. You might not recognize these names, but I promise you, you do know who they are. Quentin Blake is the illustrator of the famous Roald Dahl books that all us UK kids grew up reading. And Michael Rosen is, he's this guy.
Into the mouth. Nice.
I had no idea the meme man was an author and a poet, so you can imagine my excitement when I realized that this book was written by him. The book follows Rosen as he talks about sadness. He treats sadness almost like a separate entity, saying, "Sometimes sad is very big, it's everywhere. all over me. He talks about sometimes he has to hide the fact that he's sad because he worries that people won't like him. But other times, he's just too sad to hide it. We learn about his son Eddie when Rosen writes, "What makes me most sad is when I think about my son Eddie. He died. I loved him very, very much, but he died anyway." So now we realize this book isn't just about sadness, it's about grief and depression. Rosen takes us through the stages of grief, showing us that these emotions are in fact normal, especially when losing a loved one. Sometimes this makes me really angry, I say to myself. How dare he go and die like that? How dare he make me sad? He doesn't say anything, because he's not there anymore. Anger is a stage of grief that most people tend to feel quite guilty about. How can I feel angry at someone who's died? They didn't ask for this, they didn't want to hurt me. But the fact that this is being portrayed so bluntly in a book shows that this is normal. It's normal to feel that way, and that grief is never going to be pretty or fun, but it's okay to acknowledge that. Rosen shares that while grief is a harrowing process, life still moves on, and there is always hope. He shows us that feeling our feelings is important and that there are healthy ways to manage them. In my brother's first quote, he mentioned the importance of teaching children about emotions. My friend mentioned that showing children what to do when faced with certain situations is important, and that's what Michael Rosen has done here. Pairing this with Quentin Blake's beloved art style, this book could potentially be wonderful for children experiencing grief. A few of the responses I got on Instagram shared that sentiment, stating that children should learn about death, so long as it's done carefully. It seems like an okay depiction of grief, but I also don't really know what to do with grief myself. I've had few deaths in my life, and they've all been in recent years, so I never had to deal with it as a child. This response from my friend intrigues me because it makes me wonder, if they had learned about this as a child, would they be able to deal with grief better as an adult? And if so, could a book like Rosen's be helpful for that? I asked for the overall opinion that my volunteers had, and here's what they had to say. It seems the books were handled gently in ways suitable for children. Tact and care are incredibly important, so I would say the way they were handled sounds solid. I think it's about time, actually. We've always protected you kids, maybe a little bit too much. I think it's good that children are being shown a bit more of reality. That way they're prepared for the world and can learn how to better deal with these kinds of scenarios. I'd say that my overall opinion would be that it's fine to base picture books on dark subjects, as long as it's done lightly, excuse the pun. The illustrations aren't too graphic, and they try not to cram too much information at once. And then, for me, personally, I think it's good that these books exist, and I hope that they continue to develop. I think picture books that cover dark and taboo topics can be very important for children and adults because it shows them that they're not alone. These books have the potential to teach us more about life, how to cope with it, and help develop our understanding. Of course, just like in all media, it should be done in a way that takes the audience into consideration. I could have given you so many more examples, but I think I've droned on long enough. Maybe one day I could talk about more books, or talk about the dark themes hidden in our favorite fables, like the Little Red Riding Hood, for example. I'd love to hear what you think. Do you agree with anyone featured in this video? Do you think something completely different? Or is there something that we may have missed? I'd love to hear what you have to say. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you again soon.